Well, another section of artistry that is nurtured here at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity is composition, the pioneering and championing of new works from a wide variety of voices. That includes composers who are in residence here, mentoring other composers and engaging with the different musicians who come to work and indeed to play here. That includes Leilehua Lanzilotti, the American composer, 2022 Pulitzer Prize finalist, and a wonderful addition to the Banff Centre's ongoing conversation around music, or what we call maybe classical music, and ongoing conversations about reconciliation. Leilehua comes to us from Hawaii, part of the Kanaka Maoli community, and she joins us now on Classic 107. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me here.
First of all, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your first interactions with this sort of Western classical music. I'm again using big air quotes for our radio audience here. This sort of canon, because it's something that you also have quite a lot of experience in, this more, the air quotes are going to be flying today, traditional repertoire.
Yes, I mean, I think even from the beginning, some of my classical training was rooted in different cultural contexts, because I grew up studying the Suzuki method with Hiroko Primrose, who was in fact a student of Shinichi Suzuki. Wow. So Suzuki's my grand teacher.
Yeah, your grand teacher.
And in that context, music is a part. The method is all about music is about being nurtured by love, and everybody in a household speaks the language because their mother speaks the language or their parent speaks the language. And so if your home has that kind of language and culture in it, then you can be immersed in that culture. So I think even from the beginning of my classical training, it was through this very different lens, I think, and this very embracing and inclusive way of approaching music. And I feel really grateful to Hiroko, my teacher, and to that whole system that's continued to very deeply influence the way that my practice is so connected to community and so connected to those things, because I think that's, not just because I grew up in that method, I think, but that's so important. So really interesting, I think, to kind of even my air quotes Western music background that I have was rooted in this East Asian, right? This method that came out of East Asia, and the different kinds of ways of framing that, and that music is for everyone. And so, yes, of course, I studied in the United States, and I lived in Europe, and I have different contexts. But yes, I think, I have a kind of non-traditional background in a lot of ways.
Sure, and then that shines through in the pieces that you have been sharing with the world throughout your career. Maybe you can take us back to that sort of moment where you're starting to share works in your own voice. This is something that composers, especially as they're starting out, they try to find that sort of early, what is my voice, so to speak? What point can you recall writing something or composing something and going, oh yeah, that's me. That's Leilehua coming through the music.
It's interesting because I remember writing music when I was little and continued to do so, but I took a long time where I was focused on performing. I had a deep career as a performer. And really the first piece that I shared with anyone publicly and put my name on as, I am a capital C composer, is absolutely my piece that's played the most all over the world.
Wow.
Which is really cool. And I think I think that was a part of finding my voice as a composer and just more as becoming more involved in composing, that as soon as I started composing, that this my connection to Hawaii and my homesickness at the time living in Europe came out immediately. And it was almost as though composition was an outlet for a lot of the ways that I was trying to express myself that I didn't have other outlets for. And so I almost feel like kind of immediately when I started sharing my work that was just genuinely what my voice was. And I didn't really, it's still surprising to me that piece, Ko'uinoa, that has many, many different recordings, which is rare for a contemporary classical piece. Usually labels only want to put out music that's the premiere recording of a new piece, and then they're willing to record, 50 million versions of the Bach suites, as they should. But the fact that there are so many different recordings of Ko'uinoa, I think is shows how much people really personally connect to the piece themselves, and the idea of what it means, what we call ourselves, how what we call ourselves is important, and how we're connected in community is important, which are some of the things in the piece. And so, yeah, I'm very grateful for that, and I'm always still kind of surprised, even though it's a very regular thing that people are really moved by it.
It strikes me that people are that quality of authenticity in a piece like that one, that you have this sort of homesickness that you were describing as you were writing this, allows for that sense of community to shine through. How much are you consciously putting your community, your home context into your music, versus how much do you think subconsciously just sort of organically becomes a part of your musical output?
I guess two things on that. I think we always place intuition as in opposition to intellect or as to logic. And I think that instead, intuition, especially as a creative person, is about the sum of all of the knowledge that you've amassed, right? Like for you as a radio announcer, as a DJ, when you have these instincts about things, when you make these connections, it's not because that's not based in knowledge, quite the opposite, that as you've built this knowledge and as you've built these experiences, those things make connections. So I think definitely that's an influence in my music. Certainly there are pieces that I write that are not focused as obviously on Hawaiian culture, but I think, for example, one of the things in my music that's this texture that happens that you heard in the piece last night. I think we often hear ethnomusicology record things in the field and songs in the field, but the nature of recording, and especially in Hawaiian music, a lot of times when we record these songs, we don't have the percussion instruments that are used for dancing. And growing up dancing and hearing these songs, or some of the songs, I don't hear them without that layer of percussion in them. That's the constant sound of the rattles that, 100 people on stage are playing, or even 20 people are playing together as they move. And so for me, some of those elements of the way I hear sound and the way I layer sound are rooted in some of those ways of listening. And on the other side, and you're asking about how community is intentional in my work, as opposed to here in Canada, which is so inspiring, more than half of Native Hawaiians live outside of Hawaii. The majority of Native Hawaiians are displaced from their homes. And even those of us who live in Hawaii, majority of us are also displaced from our homeland, as opposed to places in other places in Polynesia where they have more consistency of people actually living on the same exact land that their ancestors lived on, right? So even there's this kind of two layers of displacement, right? There's the more obvious displacement of folks having to leave Hawaii, and then there's the ache of displacement even within Hawaii of not being connected to the land in the same ways. And so that's a big part of the way that a lot of my work right now is connected to diaspora, because the majority of our community is in diaspora.
There's so much to break down within all of that, and talking about those sort of conscious and subconscious connections that we make regardless of field. We've talked a lot about the connections that you have, again, back to the air quotes, to the traditional sort of classical music canon. How much are you in your work trying to break down those connections to say, no, I'm not this thing. I'm not Bach violin solo works, to go back to what you were talking about before. And so I'm not this, I'm breaking with that tradition. And here's me, here's Leilehua and the music that I'm sharing from my community, or even more specifically from my diasporic community.
Yeah, I draw a lot of inspiration in thinking about time. There's this incredible author, Rashida Phillips, that talks a lot about clock time and the way that when there is fixed time and meter in music, in my context, the way I think about it, meter in music, that we're so connected to Western clock time that's what we prioritize. And I think a lot of my music is trying to find different ways to invite people into making and listening to sound. I think that's the biggest way that some of the experimental practices in my work come out in the music that might not sound as audible in a recording. Going back to Ko'ui Noa, the notation for that is experimental because it doesn't have all of the rhythms written out exactly. Instead, it has the general way that the player should be playing a bariolage the same way that they would that arpeggiated, slurred figure that you hear a lot in Bach. But then it shows the different chords and the pacing of just the chords themselves so that the player can be listening and move between the chords and move at their own pacing. And so it's an invitation to be moving through that space in a different way that's less about executing within a clock time frame and more about listening and being present and in the sound. So a lot of my work is kind of experimenting with those things. My string quartet, Ahupua'a, that's on my last album, also a lot, the majority of the notation for that is without bar lines. And there's still a very clear pacing and intentionality. When people play the piece, it still sounds like the same piece. But the way that I'm inviting them to have the pacing move forward is very different. And this magical thing happened earlier in the summer at Ojai Festival when Jack Quartet was performing the piece. And I had been talking to them about this because, of course, they're experts at contemporary music and they could sight read the piece itself very easily. But I was inviting them to think about the way in which that invitation of a different kind of pacing allows for space for listening and allows for them to take time as things are happening before they move on. And in the concert, there was this moment in the first movement when the first violinist was playing, and I had asked him to practice that in this one spot before he came in again. And I saw, just as he was about to enter again with playing, this bird started playing. And of course in Ojai, the amphitheater is open. This bird started singing, and he waited for the bird song to become part of the piece and finish before he entered. And it invited that sound into the piece so that at the end of the piece, when they were finishing these quiet chords and they stopped and the birds started singing out of that, and this incredible thing happened where the audience waited for the birds for 30 seconds or something. They had accepted, because Austin had invited that sound in the beginning of the piece, the audience was also then listening that way by the end of the piece. And so I think having the space in that, if you had something on a time grid, you'd have to count to 4 and come in, right?
Yeah.
But when you're inviting with these different kinds of experimental notation people to think about time differently, then these different kinds of things related to listening and bringing outside sound in can happen in performance in this magical way.
As you're talking about this magical moment in the open air at Ojai, it reminds me that, again, man, I keep using these air quotes, the traditional sort of classical pieces also can employ that. I think about Otorino Respighi as an example with
Right.
the birds, or the Cantus Arcticus of Inu Johanni Rautavaara. Pieces that have very strict metrical notation, but also allow for those moments of unmetered natural magic to filter in. But at the same time, I'm thinking about pieces by Haydn and Mozart that also employ bird song in a very metered way. I guess my question is, at what point is something experimental, and at what point is it metered, rigid, not artificial? It's still music and it's still beautiful, but it is more contained. It's the difference in my mind between experimentation and just allowing something to maybe it's like making something happen versus allowing something to happen is the distinction that I'm trying to parse here as you're speaking about birdsong in particular.
I think that some of that is about the way that the invitation happens. And certainly for different ensembles, I use different techniques. I just finished the piece that I wrote the season opener for the New York Philharmonic for the fall. That's Gustavo Dudamel's first concert as the music and artistic director designate, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
And knowing that they are a professional orchestra that does what they do really, really well and has the benefit of being a huge ensemble with a conductor as a benefit, notating that piece was interesting because I was challenging myself to use the kind of traditional notation that ensemble is comfortable with and understands, and how do I work within that notation to create these same kinds of things, right? How do I invite them with the descriptive text that I include that's more abstract for them to be listening in their parts as they're playing? How do I invite that in the pacing? How do I invite that in the sound worlds and how they move through each other? And so I think, I agree with you, and I think a lot of it is about how is the invitation happening in the music, and what does that invite the player to experience, with a priority of what the players experience, which allows the audience to then have that experience of being invited through the way that the intention of the player being invited happens. I find that really interesting in notations. There's so many different ways to notate. I wouldn't say that one or the other is experimental. It's more about what is the invitation, how are we asking people to listen to sound, and the experiment of always, will it work?
Sure. It's so interesting to talk about an ensemble like the New York Philharmonic, the pinnacle of that sort of high Western arts achievement conducted by Mahler and Bernstein and whoever else, and to then have them engage in the heart of New York City, with this natural idea, with this unmarked sense of time that is so much a part of our sort of urban existence. And how receptive, I guess I'm wondering, do you find these sorts of environments to be to less rigid ideas of what music can be in a classical context?
Well, I think a lot of these ensembles we see, of course, the LA Phil, where Dudamel was before, playing so much contemporary music and really interesting different styles, having longer relationships with composers like Andrew Norman, where they really get to know their voice and how they write for orchestra as a voice. The New York Philharmonic is also being really adventurous with their programming and programming a lot of new music. And I think that the players have different contexts of, being able to actually be in the sound and be in the world of composers like Morton Feldman, right, in New York, who was also inviting a different kind of listening, and these very, very spacious works where a single player, I always feel like playing Feldman in an orchestra feels like walking in New York in the winter, because you have these very simple things that you're doing by yourself slowly through time. And the individual line doesn't have a lot of material necessarily, but altogether, the way that the orchestra interacts is this kind of quiet movement where together you have, in my mind, the scene of being in New York in the winter, and kind of the way that a city moves and the way that quietness happens. And so orchestras like that, that have that life experience, that context of those kinds of things, and have worked with contemporary composers, both as their conductors, right, and in their own lives, I think allows for this different kind of approach to the work in a really cool way. And so then I think it's about that, again, that dance of how are we communicating? Are we communicating that we appreciate the sound that they can make, and inviting them to make those sounds in different ways, or kind of asking them to do that. So, yeah.
The relationship between composer and ensemble that you just described, it occurs to me, is also not one that is new, perhaps, but it's maybe coming around. The example that pops to my mind is the orchestra in Mannheim performing works by Stamitz in the 18th century, somebody who was a part of that community and then able to communicate these, at the time, very innovative ideas about music to that ensemble, and we still see the impacts of that today. Maybe 'twas ever thus, but it does also feel like this is bringing back an idea of communal music making, that this is not just a prestige art form anymore where only the select handful are able to not only perform it or understand it, but also that it opens the door then for an audience to just be immersed in the experience. And it's a communal model that also takes me back to the way that you were talking about your community before. How does this kind of music that you write for an ensemble like the New York Philharmonic, how does that resonate, do you think, if you think about your own community back in Hawaii and that diaspora that you were referencing before as well?
Well, I mean, it's really exciting. I think, there are definitely a lot of folks coming out for the concert, and it's really meaningful to people. I think we always want to prioritize excellence, and I'm really grateful that when I get these commissions, that they are relying on me because I turn things in on time, and the score is a high quality, and all of those things. But also then for the community, the representation really still does matter for a lot of people. We see, there's a big difference. We think about stereotype threat, which is an interesting thing, which is the idea that, if I am inviting you in to give you a math test, and I say, we know that men are terrible at math, but we're doing this study about how terrible men are at math, and we just want you to take this test to see how you do.
Okay.
We know you're going to do a really terrible job,
right.
But good luck with that, right? Like if you're hearing that as you're in these different spaces, you're going to do worse on that test than if you take it in a different context where you don't have that, or in that example, of course, in a society where there are lots of brilliant male mathematicians, and so that's not an issue. And so there's one of the ways that researchers have found that counters stereotype threat is having strong examples of people that have come before who have achieved and are doing things. And so the notion of exclusion in some of these different kinds of things in classical music is, so much more inclusive, and there's so much more going on. But to have Indigenous composers and Pacifica composers included in these kinds of spaces, I think means a lot, because it's changing that narrative and creating different kinds of context for people to combat stereotype threat in different ways. So that always, I've done a bunch of research on this and kind of building curriculum in the other work that I've done. And so it's certainly not why I wrote the piece, but I recognize being there and being there in person, that it's important to be there in person, because there is an element of that and the responsibility of that, which can feel like a lot sometimes, but I think it's important for us to show up.
This is a relationship that you're describing between communities and orchestras and ensembles, allowing new voices to engage in this space. Not even necessarily new voices, but maybe less than traditional voices to engage in this space, is something that orchestras and ensembles here in Canada are engaging with quite a lot as we continue down this journey of reconciliation between settler and Indigenous peoples. From your vantage point, as you sit here at the Banff Centre and engage with the music making that happens here, what are your maybe impressions or observations about this relationship that classical musicians, settler classical musicians, are trying to do to widen that circle of inclusion for this music to engage with Indigenous composers and creatives to help facilitate these relationships as we continue to try and right these historic wrongs?
Yeah, I think having people engage in really thoughtful curation, the way that Joel Brennan has for this festival, someone who's actually deeply involved in commissioning a lot of Indigenous composers, Aboriginal because he lives in Australia.
Yeah.
And one of those being Aaron Wyatt, who was also on the program last night, who's a great composer. And it makes a difference to be in a different context if you're always kind of the token other, then everything always feels like being othered.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate that specifically with the programming that Joel's doing, but also in the larger sense with the First Nations programming and dedicated programming that they have here at Banff, with special sessions for Indigenous curators and special sessions. My sister came out and did one of the performing arts sessions just for Indigenous artists. And so I think that's really, really special and is hard to find in a lot of places. So I'm really inspired that Banff is making that effort, that they have initiatives to allow Indigenous musicians to participate in some of the festivals for free if they're First Nations Canadian composers or anybody, musicians. And I think, as always, there's still more for us to do, but I think we always look at Canada as a model of kind of being more ahead of things. There's Hawaii's kind of contentious because of a lot of things. The United States admitted in 1993, they apologized, admitting of all of the reasons why the overthrow was illegal, which has led to some interesting things happening culturally there now in Hawaii. At the same time, Hawaiians are not federally recognized, right? So there's this kind of tug between still the kind of feeling of occupation there, but also no recognition. And so it's an interesting, very multi-layered conversation about kind of what does it mean to have, does recognition help towards reconciliation? Or is it more about continued efforts for language sovereignty and water sovereignty and care of land? We may say all of those things, right? But I think there's still a long way to go. That in a lot of ways in that broader conversation, and Hawaii has always felt like a separate place. I've always only ever said that I'm from Hawaii.
Yeah, right.
But it's those things that we're talking about with more than half of Hawaiians living outside of Hawaii in diaspora, connected with the fact that it's not a federally recognized tribe, means that displacement has another layer to it, right? That people really don't feel like they're at home. They're displaced from this other home as a Pacific nation that's a part of this other community that they're missing.
Wow. I mean, there's so much to think about with all of that. As you continue to add your voice to that conversation in all of its forms in ensembles, not just in the United States, but all over the world, what will you take away from this place, working here at the Banff Centre, that will maybe not help, but add to your voice as you continue to lend it to that conversation? Are there other birds, for instance, here that maybe you add to your compositions that maybe you haven't before?
No, I think for sure being in community, being able to see the weather change here and just be in the presence of sacred Buffalo Guardian Mountain. As this being a place of gathering and thinking about what that means and gathering energy and taking that with us. I think it's always an honor to be here, and I'm really glad to be. I feel a lot of respect and care went into the programming and the context for my work here, and so I really appreciate that a lot.
I really appreciate the time that you've taken to speak with us today, Leilehua, and I know that I'll speak for my listeners, and that we're so grateful for the context and the vision and the artistry that you share, not only here at the Banff Centre, but also with our listeners back in Winnipeg or wherever you might be tuning in on the Classic 107 website or app. I feel like I could talk to you all day, but for now, Leilehua, thank you so much for taking the time, and I'm so excited to see whatever comes next in your career and whatever voice you continue to add to these important conversations.
Thank you. Mahalo nui loa.